So I did a little bit of research today before tonight's meeting, just because I was curious as to how many times our speaker tonight has given presentations in the past. At our September meeting, when we had Robert Miller here, many of you know who Robert Miller is, but he is our most frequent outside guest speaker. But tonight's speaker is most likely our most frequent speaker that's also a KAS member. And so does anybody want to guess what number presentation this is for tonight's speaker?
22.
37. No, it's not that many.
That many.
13. That's it exactly. Wow. This is his 13th.
Oh, it's
And I say it's his 13th solo presentation. As I was digging through some old newsletters, we had some meetings, and we had a meeting in 1997, where 3 people talked about the Mars Pathfinder mission. Mike was one of those, and we also had, I think, the following year, we had a group of people talk about the Messier Marathon, and Mike was one of those. But this is his 13th solo presentation tonight, and I just kind of wanted to go through them. I'm guessing most people weren't here for some of the early ones, but hopefully many of you were here for some of the more recent ones. So the very first presentation, the one that I could find, was on November 6, 1998, and that was on meteors, meteorites, and the coming of the Leonids. Okay? I don't know if Mike remembers that one.
Vaguely.
The next one was on November 3rd, 2000. That was on black holes. And then again on November 1st, you can kind of see he was a November speaker there for a while. So it was on November 1st, 2002. That one was Cosmology, or How I Came to Understand Life, the Universe, and Everything. Yeah, right. Okay.
It's all been disproved.
November 14th, 2003 was over the greatest scientist of all time, Sir Isaac Newton. November 5th, 2004 was over William Herschel. November 4th, 2005 was over Edwin Hubble. January 5th, 2007 was second only to Newton, The Life of Christiaan Huygens. January 11th, 2008 was titled The Unknown Astronomer, which was about Simon Newcomb, a Canadian-American astronomer. March 6, 2009 was titled An Unwanted Idea, The Short but Provocative History of Black Holes. So another talk about black holes. March 5th, 2010 was Astronomy Before Copernicus, the Ptolemaic Tradition. March 4th, 2011 was called Bad Science. That was the only talk of his that I missed because a group of us were down at the Winter Star Party. April 5th, 2013 was titled From Quantum Mechanics to Cosmology, Dreams of Unification. And tonight's talk, on February the 13th, your lucky day, is The Science and Science Fiction. So again, you all know our guest speaker. He teaches right in this building. He teaches astronomy, physics, geology, and calculus. He, of course, is a past president of the Kalamazoo Astronomical Society. He was the president during the first 6 years of our resurrection, which kind of began around 1996. In 2013, he was named one of 6 teachers nationwide as the Kennedy Center Stephen Sondheim Inspirational Teacher awardee. And he was also the 2006 Michigan High School Teacher of the Year. So without further ado, please welcome 13-time speaker Mike Sinclair.
Well, my talk tonight is actually a blending of my 2 loves, which of course is science in general, but science fiction, which is how I got into science. Many of us, I'm sure, kind of wandered into science through this back door, and in the process of me trying to describe how I got there, I also want to incorporate a little bit about how science works in science fiction, because science fiction to me is in many respects a driving force for everything that we try to study, everything we try to see. I will point out that I'm going to leave off most of the biological related sciences, because I'm not, and not really interested, although I will mention a few that are really phenomenal short stories and books and movies. And I'm going to stay away from chemistry because I don't actually know of any movies about chemistry, unfortunately, or books, or short stories, or anything. Mostly about astronomy, space, which is kind of the fundamental piece to all of this. And I'll start off by describing a little bit about science, how you put science in science fiction. And I'll talk about forms of science fiction, because there's so many anymore. And you can see, obviously, from my very first PowerPoint slide, this is probably one of the greatest science fiction series of all time. It's the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov, written in the 1950s. It actually was, in 2001, considered the greatest science fiction series of the 20th century, fantasy science fiction series, with J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings come in second. So obviously this is an amazing series. Describes psychohistory, which is this blend of using mathematics and psychology and historical developments by Isaac Asimov, and has just won an amazing number of awards. And although Asimov was an incredibly prolific writer, this is certainly one of his greatest pieces. And then in the 1980s and 1994, he passed away. He kind of put some other pieces together from the series known as the I, Robot series, a robotic series. Which, of course, as some of you know, was made into a horrifically terrible movie. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what good science requirements are in science fiction. First off, and this is the most annoying thing that ever happens to me in a movie theater. There is no sound in space. Space is a vacuum. Now that means there are particles, but like 1 part per, cubic kilometers. You can't have sound propagate through space. So every time I watch a movie in which there's an explosion in space, you see a big fireball, you hear a reverberation in the theater, it just drives me insane, because I know for a fact it's not real. And almost every time that right there, it just kind of ruins the movie for me. With one exception, that's Star Wars, and I'll talk about that later. Which is, I'm sorry, but it's just something that just has annoyed me since I think I was 9 years old. When you grow up reading science fiction, you learn a little bit of science, because many of the science fiction writers had very good backgrounds in science. A handful were actually engineers and scientists, like Arthur C. Clarke. Isaac Asimov had a PhD in biochemistry. So these are people who actually have a really good understanding of science, and that's why they bring it into their stories. So whenever I see a movie that's got sound in space, that just torques me. It just doesn't work real well. I have some real issues with it, and I'll give one example. So a number of years ago, my wife and I were at a movie called Mission to Mars, which I'm sure some of you have seen, which had Tim Robbins freezing his head instantly, which was hilariously funny. It had Gary Sinise with the worst eye makeup I've ever seen in my entire life. They did a close-up on him, and he actually looked like somebody punched him in the face. And there's a scene where Tim Robbins is in this little kind of MMU maneuvering unit flying around the spaceship to find a leak because it got hit by a micrometeor. And every time he fires off the little jets, it goes and makes the little sound of puffs. And I'm sitting in the theater, and this is kind of the point where things really went south for me. And I couldn't help it. I have no filter at times, unfortunately. And I went, that's bullshit. And at that time, about 6 people got up and moved about 4 rows away. My wife moved the end of the row. But I had lots of room. And I unfortunately, I mumbled to myself that entire movie. It went really south from there. So, no sound in space. That's the number one thing. If you're going to have a good science fiction movie, in my opinion, and certainly I'm not the most qualified in this, but, 2001 Space Odyssey, Interstellar, Serenity, a movie that was made kind of Josh Whedon's way of kind of wrapping up Firefly, and even Ender's Game, parts of it. It's really weird. Sometimes they put it in, sometimes they don't. generally doesn't have sound in space. So that's a handful of decent movies that kind of make sense and it kind of works. The second item, distances are huge. Oh, this drives me insane. I mean, it's just, I'm sorry, but it's a little OCD here. Whenever you have a shot where somebody's on a planet and they look up and they see a galaxy in all of its glory, damn, you got to be close to the center of that galaxy, which means you're not going to see anything like that. One of the worst endings of any movie was, of course, Mission to Mars, where Gary Sinise rockets off in this kind of weird thing, and the astronauts are flying away from Mars, the remaining astronauts who survive. They look back and they see Sinise heading off toward a galaxy. Okay, relative position on Earth. The Andromeda Galaxy is pretty good sized. It's about a little bigger than the Moon. And with the naked eye, it's just a faint, fuzzy cloud. I would assume in space, with the naked eye, helmet and everything, it'd probably be a little bit clearer, but not much clearer. A little atmospheric haze, but this thing looked monstrous. Like, where'd that galaxy come from? And that was the last straw. Because at that point, I'm just shaking my head, going, "No, it doesn't happen." Mass. Things are big to travel through space. The spaceships are big. That means they're big. I mean, it just doesn't work properly. Scales of size. I go from this planet to that planet in 10 seconds. Another thing that drives me crazy is that whole, spaceships are docking. They fly into a bay and land. How the hell do they do that? There's no gravity, so, I mean, is there something artificial? I mean, I have no clue. I mean, it's sad. All right, law of inertia. Anybody who understands the laws of physics knows that Isaac Newton and Galileo Galilei knew this 400 years ago. Okay? Objects travel in straight lines unless acted upon by an outside force. And they travel in straight lines when acted upon by an outside force. The only reason we see curved paths on Earth is because of the gravity field. So when I throw a ball, it follows a parabola because of the gravity field we're in. But if I'm in deep space, away from everything, spaceships don't curve and sweep through space. Because, one, there's nothing to curve and sweep against. That's called air. In space, let's go back to number one. There's no sound in space because there's nothing in space. It's a vacuum, so spacecraft don't need wings. They don't need to sweep and swerve, and they never do. And as a result, I expect spacecraft to move in straight lines. Now, if you go on NASA's website and you look up some of the Apollo space missions, they have video where the lunar modules and command modules were moving towards each other to dock. And you can actually see that as the spacecraft's approaching, it will do this kind of straight line maneuver, shifting position until it gets lined up. And it takes a long time for these things to approach because you're traveling in straight lines. It takes a lot of practice to be able to fly from point A to point B and dock. For example, to dock on the International Space Station, the last 10 meters takes them almost an hour because they want to line it up properly because they know they're going to be pushing with a certain amount of speed into it, and when it docks into it, it's got to dock with just the right amount of speed to lock into place. And so as a result, things go in straight lines. Years ago, I saw John Grunfeld, who is now the head of the astronaut office, and he had 4 missions in space, 3 of them repair missions with the Hubble Space Telescope, and 1 on the International Space Station. And Grunfeld told a story about how you can always tell a rookie in space versus an old-timer in space. Because a rookie in space, when you ask a rookie to hand you something, or to toss you something, which is the proper term, so for example, if I'm going to toss this to anybody in the room, so Spencer, I'm going to toss this to you, watch the path. Okay, now throw it back. Okay, now you'll notice a couple of you'll notice a couple of things. First off, follow a curved path. The second thing is, when I threw it and when Spencer threw it back, you have to add enough velocity to it so that it actually reaches him. When you're in your International Space Station, you're in free fall, which means the spacecraft is falling at the same acceleration, the same velocity as you. It means you're floating relative to the spacecraft. You're still in the gravity field. If you don't believe that, if you don't believe you're in space, there's no gravity, explain to me how the moon stays in orbit around us. Okay? So in this case, what Grunfeld said is a rookie astronaut, when you ask them to throw them something, will toss it like they do on Earth. They'll add this velocity, and when it releases, it goes off in a straight line or rockets all over the spacecraft, nearly killing people. The way you pass something in space is you hold it up, you point it at the person, and you gently push it, and it floats across the spacecraft. Because it follows Newton's first law. I don't understand. I mean, I've seen this actually. If you watch Apollo 13, which is not science fiction but a true story, which, by the way, when audiences left, they were given polls. You know, the new people who were given that kind of first run were asked about the movie, and most of them said, "Well, I didn't like the ending because it was too Hollywood." They survived. You realize it is a truth. Never mind. If you watch that, there were times when the astronauts in the spacecraft, Kevin Bacon, Bill Paxton, and Tom Hanks, were actually throwing things at each other. And you watch them. There's a scene where, in fact, Kevin Bacon is taking one of the mission binders, and they're looking down the lunar module tunnel, and he just pushes it, and it floats down the tunnel, straight line, just like the laws of physics requires. And the reason they could do that, because they didn't use wires, they were flying on a KC-135 aircraft known as the Vomit Comet, and they're flying parabolas. And as soon as it tops over the parabola, they get 45 seconds of free fall. And they would go for like 4 flights a day, and they'd film 45-second pieces at a time, so it was in free fall, so it looked like free fall. I want free fall to be free fall, and I want the law of inertia to be like the law of inertia. Okay, when I see that, I have a pretty good feel for how this works. Ender's Game's a great example of that. Almost every science fiction writer who writes these things understands that. The speed of light. Okay, I'm not opposed to breaking the speed of light. I mean, laws of physics make it pretty clear that we don't know how to do that. There may be ways around it. Maybe it requires, multi-dimensional space or hyperspace or wormholes. Who knows? But every time I see a movie that spacecraft go faster than the speed of light, with one exception, I'm usually kind of like, yeah. I mean, yeah, to travel these huge distances are huge. Yeah, we probably do have to have some kind of way to get around it in science fiction. But in real science, you can't do that. You can't travel faster than the speed of light. The rules are really pretty clear at this point in our understanding of the technology. There may be ways around it, as I'll point out and talk about Interstellar a little bit, but the speed of light is really kind of the big thing. The only time I've actually seen a movie that actually kind of blew me away in terms of traveling the speed of light was, of course, the first Star Wars movie, where Han Solo and the Millennium Falcon decides they're going to go light speed, and you see the streams of light go past. And if you look at it carefully, first time I noticed this, they turn blue as they go by. That's special relativistic effect. You're shortening wavelengths. It's awesome. The more I watch it now, it's like, well, I think it was just a fluke. I don't think Lucas knew. But the speed of light is one that always kind of gets me. I don't have a problem with colonization of other planets and how we get there. That's a story. But if you're going to do something with the speed of light, give me some reason to kind of describe how you can go faster than the speed of light. Don't just assume, well, we just go really fast, because you can't. You just can't go that fast. I mentioned free fall already. That's pretty straightforward. Aliens are alien. Okay? My biggest complaint about the early Star Trek series is that all the aliens were like you and me. They had, 4 fingers and a thumb. They had head, 2 eyes, 2 ears, a mouth, a nose, 2 legs, 2 arms. They look like human beings. There's no requirement that we have to have those things. There's a lot of life on the planet Earth, which is asymmetric. There's a lot of life that's reasonably symmetric that doesn't have just 2 arms and 2 legs. Limb formation doesn't require, 4 fingers and a thumb. I mean, I would expect a tool-making society to have a thumb, because, grasping kind of thing. But, 3-finger objects is kind of cool. Aliens don't always have to have, straightforward heads that look like humans, or, in the old days of Gene Roddenberry, really big skulls to make them smart. In fact, the larger the brain, that doesn't necessarily mean you're smarter. But to me, aliens should be alien. And at the same time, there went the gavel. At the same time, I love a good movie that has a kind of a language associated with it, which is different than human language. So I will admit, I don't speak Klingon, as much as people may think I can. No, I cannot speak Klingon. The development of Klingon as kind of a side note of Star Trek, I think was a pretty cool idea. It's a little different, but aliens should be completely different. I would love to see a movie where, actually one of my favorite short stories is called First Contact, where they run into an alien race which is really different than humans. I mean, they have some things that are similar to humans. They're bipedal. they have two eyes, but they see in the infrared, and they don't see invisible light. But they do have two sexes, just like humans. And the gist of the story, the brilliant part of the story is at the very end, they're asking one of the people, because the way they decide to go back to their own planets, they switch ships. They switch all of this material on both spaceships, and they take the other ships back to their own planet. First contact, you just don't want them following us home. They don't want us following us home, so it's really following them home. So it's very clever how you have to do this. But one of the cool things about the story was that at the end of the story, one of the main characters, the protagonist in the story, tells his captain that they spent the last hour on board ship as they were transferring stuff, telling dirty jokes, which I thought was brilliant because they can be alien, but they must be different. Language of science. Let me give you an example of a bad case of a language of science in a science fiction movie. So there's this classic movie called The Day the Earth Stood Still, which was made in the 1950s, really kind of at the height of the Cold War. And I will admit, Michael Rennie is, pretty, standoffish. His gut gored. But in early 2000s, they remade that with Keanu Reeves, which was actually kind of perfect because he was just like emotionless anyway. But there's a scene in the beginning when they're describing this thing coming to Earth where they're flying these science site in Washington, D.C., or Central Park, New York City, that's right. And one of the scientists goes, yes, we tracked it traveling 2.7 times 10 to the 8th meters per second through the atmosphere. And I'm going, okay, there's two things wrong with that. Thing number one is wrong with it, okay? Physicists, astronomers don't refer to speeds in terms of meters per second. If they're traveling really fast, we refer to them with respect to the speed of light. So what he should have said was it was traveling 9/10 the speed of light, or 0.9 c, or 90% the speed of light. That would have been a cool way of putting it. Instead, to make it sound science-y, 2.7 times 10 to the 8 meters per second. Okay, that's stupid. Secondly, if you're traveling that speed into the upper atmosphere as an object, you're going to ablate the entire spacecraft and destroy it. And of course, when it hits the Earth, because it will not be able to just come to a complete stop without shedding tons of energy, you're going to obliterate the entire atmosphere and wipe out the Earth anyway, which is kind of the gist of the story. I should have just done it first. Made the movie a lot quicker and a lot more interesting. Sorry. Stretching facts is okay. I have no problem with these stretching facts. Good fiction stretches a fact. It takes an idea and kind of stretches it a little bit. And it kind of throws out an idea which, it could be wrong. Absolutely wrong. But if you stretch it and you kind of play it up, it makes for a really interesting story. And I think that's something that's expected as someone who reads a lot of science fiction. I expect the science to be really decent in there, but I also expect you to kind of, throw my imagination out there. One of my favorite stories was written by Larry Niven, where they're describing buzzard ramjets, which are colonizing different places. And one of the things he talks about is getting really close to the speed of light. And of course, there's this transition in terms of age. But they land on planets that are close to us, exoplanets that are close to us. Well, when he wrote these stories in the 1980s, we didn't know that the exoplanets were really far away. We figured like Alpha Centauri is 5 light years away, a little under that. There might be, if it's a red dwarf, there might be a planet around there that we could actually colonize. And so you stretch the facts. Years later you find out it doesn't work that way. In my astronomy class, I give my students a reading. It's a short story by Larry Niven called Neutron Star, which I'll reference a little bit later. It talks about flying past a neutron star and what you would observe. And I asked the students to read the story, knowing what they know about neutron stars and what they can read about neutron stars online. Tell me what things were right in it, what things were wrong. Niven wrote this short story a year before we discovered the first neutron stars. And he was really close. But half the things in that story are really pretty cool. They're pretty close to reality. And he stretched a little bit, no problem. Finally, good science does not mean a bad movie. Okay? I've seen a lot of really bad movies that have really horrible science. And I've seen some really amazing movies with really good science. And I've seen a few that are kind of a mixture. And I think that's really a spectrum anyway. But I think the biggest issue that I have is that writers and directors generally are, they're filmmakers. And they don't know any science. They really don't understand science. And for many years, scientists would not get involved in these things because, they're not writing technical papers. They're not doing technical research. And as a result, you had people just making stuff up. As much as I appreciate Star Trek, you just can't go from planet to planet and solar system in a matter of warp factor 5 or something. You have to have something in there that's decent science. My biggest complaint, for example, with Star Trek Voyager, the next to last Star Trek series, Enterprise came after that, which I thought was weird. The spaceship was better than the 1960s version, was that they just threw out all this technobabble. They were just making up words and throwing it out there because it sounded sciencey, and I think that just drives me insane. I want decent science that tells the story. All right, so let's talk a little bit about science fiction in general. There are lots of forms of science fiction, by the way. 5 general ones that I look at. Short stories, which is how I really kind of got started in it. Novels and novellas. Novellas being about 2/3 to a half the length of a normal novel. A lot of 1960s and 70s, and even before that, science fiction included like a novella and then several short stories in collections, which is a standard way of doing it. Graphic novels, kind of the big thing in the last 15 years or so. I'll even reference that. I have a handful of graphic novels. I read comic books when I was a kid, like a lot of people do. But graphic novels are really a big extension of that. And I'm not talking about superhero stories here. So no Spider-Man, no Superman, none of that. Television, of course, and movies. And I'm sorry, I'm not ignoring things like film shorts, webcasts, fan fiction, or counts fiction anyway. There's a lot of little video clips, not counting cartoons. I'm just talking about what I consider to be, in my mind, the type of science fiction that I really appreciate watching. And they're not really mainstream cartoons to a great extent are, but too bad. Okay? So, eras. There are roughly 6 eras in science fiction. There's the first works of science fiction, which I'll talk about in a second. The 19th century, which really is focused around Jules Verne. And at the end of the 19th century, that's H.G. Wells' era. And that included the early 20th century. And Wells had some really prophetic ideas that he would incorporate into his stories. And then the golden age of science fiction. I think we're in a second golden age, personally, at this point. I'll explain that a little bit as well. But the golden age of science fiction was from roughly the mid to late 1920s to about the early 1950s. It was about a 30-year period which there was just absolutely astonishing science fiction. I discovered this when I was about 12 or 13. I was reading the current 1960s stuff, and then I discovered the golden age, which was pretty cool. Then science fiction during the Cold War, really a much different style of science fiction than what I would call today kind of modern science fiction. There was a TV program on BBC called The Real History of Science Fiction. They went through several of the science fiction writers. They came up with 4 eras. I liked 6, and the main reason is because they didn't really reference the very first one, and they didn't really talk about these as being separate entities. Anything after the Golden Age is just classified as kind of one era, and I really think that there's 6 that are pretty distinct. So the first thing I want to talk about before we get into those eras are the genres. There are 2 genres of science fiction. There's hard science, which means it follows the rules of physics religiously. In other words, you can't go faster than the speed of light. You have to follow those rules. You got to follow inertia. You have to follow the basic behaviors and patterns of science. There's soft science, which allows things like faster than the speed of light travel, FTL, faster than light travel. There's rapid evolution. There are some alternative pieces built into this. Subgenres that actually show up in both of these areas include these major topics. And the first one is alternative history. In fact, the first major set of stories that kind of came out of the Golden Age are really focused on alternative history. Time travel has always been kind of a big one. I'll mention a few really good movies that incorporate that. Space westerns versus space operas. Right? Space westerns are basically, protagonist, antagonist, battle, come to a conclusion, climax, and you're happy. Space operas are big things. Foundation series is space opera in most respects. Military science fiction. There's been a handful of people who write really good military science fiction. Joe Haldeman, probably the best. But there are other people who've written some really amazing stuff. And then that's pretty hard science fiction that incorporates a lot of technology in warfare. But there's been some newer writings that include some of the softer science, a lot of psychological stuff, which I think is kind of cool. Cyberpunk, this is really William Gibson's work. This is the era of the late 20th century. And this is very much linking computers into everything. And in fact, William Gibson wrote some amazing short stories and books that incorporate, human beings that are implants and all that kind of stuff, and we talk about that as well. Psychological science fiction, it's really weird. This was about a 15-year block. There was a lot of it. There's not nearly as much now. It's a genre, subgenre that kind of moved in and out. But Philip K. Dick is the most famous for his work, and I'll mention him because they've made a lot of movies off his stuff, and he was really screwed up. Social science fiction is actually kind of tied into space operas. The Foundation series is a good example of social science fiction with a space opera. It blends what happens with large groups of people, how large planetary populations interact, and repercussions of discovering life in another solar system. And then apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic. This is kind of the hot area right now in young adults. Primarily because of the Hunger Games and the Divergent series, and I'm not saying bad things about those. I think Hunger Games is actually the decent sequence. Divergent's a little iffy. Maze Runner, some of these, it's kind of a weird thing. I've come to the conclusion that one of the worst science fiction books I've ever read, though, is Cormac McCarthy's Road book, which is, I don't know what to talk about. There's pain in my head. All right, so let's talk about the beginnings of science fiction. Very first science fiction story ever written was by Johannes Kepler. Laws of Planetary Science, Planetary Motion. Somnium, he wrote in 1628, just a few years before he passed away. And it's basically a description of a trip to the moon. Somnium because it's a dream. He dreams about a sailing ship that sails to the moon. He believed the moon had an atmosphere. That was pretty clear by most people that wasn't there. But he describes what he thinks the moon's like, and he describes it very much kind of like what it is. I mean, he talks about rolling soft hills, not these sharp, jagged hills that a lot of 1950s sci-fi movies had. He describes that you'd have to you take your food with you and you have to bring it back. And he wakes up as he's returning, so he doesn't really talk about how he gets there and back, which is kind of sad. But it was actually a very cleverly written story. It was incorporated in some of his other works. He wrote 2 versions of it that really were quite a bit different, and several small pieces that he would reference with some of his other writings. And I always found that was really fascinating that here's a scientist who writes science fiction. Scientists don't generally write science fiction. They're doing science, and science fiction writers tend to have some science backgrounds, but they kind of give up science if they're going to do science fiction altogether. And scientists tend not to write that. Jonathan Swift, of course, many of you have probably seen the various versions of Gulliver's Travels. He wrote that in 1726, mostly satirical. But Gulliver's Travels also made a prediction. And this is another thing we love about science, is good science fiction kind of makes a prediction. He predicted that Mars had 2 moons. This was before we discovered Phobos and Deimos. It hadn't been discovered back for another, 15, 20 years, Richard? I can't remember off the top of my head. Mid-1700s. He predicted that Mars had 2 moons, that the people in his little travels had actually discovered 2 moons orbiting Mars, and they were very small, which is basically true. Mary Shelley, 1818, she wrote Frankenstein. Yeah, it's a horror gothic story, but it really is about using electricity to generate life. Okay, this is actually an extension of Luigi Galvani's experiments in the 1700s. And Alessandra Volta's development of the voltaic pile, making batteries. The idea that you could take electricity and regenerate life. Her story puts together parts from different people to create a living monster. And by the way, Frankenstein is not the monster; it's just a monster. Frankenstein was the doctor who created it, as most of you who saw Young Frankenstein know. Jules Verne, From the Earth to the Moon. Jules Verne was probably the first really prolific science fiction writers. He wrote a number of books, but From the Earth to the Moon to me is the classic. He describes traveling from the Earth to the Moon. He does it with propulsion. They build a huge cannon in Florida, on the coast, the east coast of Florida. They aim the cannon where the moon's going to be in 3 days. They blast off this shell, and granted, if that actually happened, we'd all die, in the spacecraft. But he launches this projectile, and it goes to the moon, and the moon intersects, and it crashes on the moon, and they get out and explore the moon, and it's sitting on a cliff, so when they get back in, they fall off the cliff, and it takes them back to Earth, which is wrong, but that's not bad. But this, I think, was probably the first book that really fired up a lot of people's imagination about traveling to the moon. Before that, there's stories, but this book made people think, is it possible to launch something that will get us to the moon? And And a lot of what he does is again, very prophetic. He talks about, floating in free fall. Now, he was wrong in one respect. In his spacecraft, as it flies to the moon, he assumes Earth's gravity is going to pull you in one direction. So the astronauts, they brought a dog too. Have a dog. And anyway, they all kind of float to the aft end of the spacecraft that's heading to the moon. When it crosses the position where the moon's gravity becomes greater than the Earth's gravity, everybody drifts towards the front of the spacecraft. Now, that's not really true. They're all falling at the same rate. But, he talks about gravity wells. I mean, it's a gravity well before a gravity well, which I think is pretty impressive. H.G. Wells, who came after him, he's a generation after. Amazing set of stories. He could write about anything, incredibly prolific writer. War of the Worlds, of course, the most famous, mostly because it's been made into like 4 movies, all of them pretty bad. But, he saw the shape of things to come. He talked about the late 20th century. And yeah, he was wrong on a whole bunch of stuff, but he was kind of right on a whole bunch of things. Self-propelled vehicles, that was just the beginning of his era. And he imagined a world where everybody drove, got into a vehicle, a horseless carriage, and drove places. And in fact, the London Times wrote an article about his book, The Shape of Things to Come, in which they said that was the most bizarre prediction that anybody could ever possibly come up with. It cannot happen. They issued a retraction in 1974. A handful of us grew up reading the Edgar Rice Burroughs Barsoom series. Edgar Rice Burroughs, of course, is famous for Tarzan. But in fact, he was better known by most young people for Princess of Barsoom, and Barsoom being Mars. And it had this kind of weird transport system. They made a horrible Disney movie called John Carter. Should have just called it Barsoom. People actually might have gone to it. But where it kind of actually incorporates the first 2 books in the series. He wrote 30 years of these, about, I think, 9 different books. More than that. But it's a fascinating story because he incorporated some kind of cool historical logic. Now, the Barsoom series takes place in the 1860s and 1870s after the American Civil War, and that's John Carter's the protagonist, and here he goes back and forth to Mars and travels through this kind of weird time junction wormhole thing. But it was actually pretty cleverly written. He talks about the lower gravity on Mars, hopping on the surface of Mars, which they incorporated in the movie, which I thought was pretty cool. And then for all of us who were born in this era, Tom Swift Jr. Tom Swifties. Okay? Tom was very excited, he said excitedly. I mean, Tom Swift and the Outpost of Space. This is my first set of science fiction books. When I was 8 or 9 years old, my parents bought me 4 of the early Tom Swift books, and I think I read all 4 of them on Christmas Day. And then demanded I collect them. And I think there's like 35 in the series or something like this, and I had at one time like 26 of them. And then when I went in the Army, my mom just gave them away to Salvation Army. I'm a sad person now. Been sad for a long time. This Victor Appleton II, by the way, that's the author. Actually, there's 2 series. There's the Tom Swift series, which came before that, 1938 to 1953, and then Tom Swift Jr., which is his son. Tom Swift Sr. was written by Victor Appleton I, and Tom Swift Jr. written by Victor Appleton II. There's no Victor Appleton on this planet, not that time anyway, who actually wrote these. It was just a series of kind of pulp writers who got hired to write a Tom Swift story. And he incorporates a lot of really kind of cool ideas, and it was kind of fun to read those. And anyone who wants to kind of get into a little science, this is written like the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew series, very easy to read. You can go through one of those books in like 40 minutes or so. If you want to read the classic, young adult science fiction of the 1960s, these are the books to read. I still collect them. I have like 5. Almost replaced them. All right, so the golden age of science fiction, late 1920s to about the early 1950s. This is John W. Campbell, who was an incredibly insightful editor. Took over as the publisher and editor of Astounding Science Fiction. And he hired, this was really the first time when science fiction writers could make a living. The H.G. Wells and Jules Verne's, yeah, they were novelists, but these were short story writers for the most part. And they wrote tons of short stories, and this is where Isaac Asimov made his start. Frederick Pohl, Robert Heinlein, who is incredibly famous for a lot of his books. Now, Arthur C. Clarke's first publication was a astounding science fiction story. A. Van Vogt, James Blish, Damon Knight, who wrote some really good stuff and some really horrifically bad stuff. And separated from them, which I've actually separated from them, is Ray Bradbury and Stan Lim. Both those guys wrote lots of science fiction, really short stories. Ray Bradbury wrote a lot of very, very short stories, but they never published much in astounding science fiction. And this magazine is still in existence. There's versions of it. It kind of goes in and out, off and on. But this is after I started getting through Tom Swift. This is what I started looking for. And I go to the library, which weirdly enough, when I was living in Bozeman, Montana, as a high school student, they actually had a subscription to astounding science fiction. So I read everything I get my hands on. I really wanted to learn how to write short stories, good science fiction short stories. These are amazing, and now a lot of them are in collections. But John Campbell had this brilliant idea that he was going to pay writers like 3 cents a word, which in the 1920s and 30s was an astounding amount of money. And more importantly, he was going to advertise. And he advertised in things like Look magazine and Time magazine, and the newest editions coming out. And sure enough, this thing sold. And there was a generation, obviously, 1930s to 1950s, a generation of kids who grew up on this, that created nuclear weapons and got it started on the path to the moon. So it obviously kind of worked. Cold War science fiction is a little darker, obviously. Frank Herbert, those of you who've read Dune or seen movies, the horrible movie, and then the 2 made-for-TV series that sci-fi in its youthful infancy and really wanted to get a good audience made. Roger Zelazny, Harlan Ellison, who wrote some really strange stories, but also wrote some amazing stories. Ursula Le Guin is the first time you begin to read female writers. Most female writers didn't really get into science fiction until the 1960s and 70s. A couple of them wrote under male names. And it took a little longer for them to get into it. Philip K. Dick, who wrote these very strange psychological movies. The Man in the High Castle. This is incredible. This is going to be a miniseries, by the way, on Sci-Fi Network. They're in the process of filming it, putting it together now and filming it. It is at the end of the official World War II, the United States loses. And Japan and Germany split up the continental United States. And the Man in the High Castle is kind of the person who runs this part of the country. And it's a lot of intrigue and kind of Cold War motifs in the 1970s. Philip K. Dick wrote a lot of this stuff. Minority Report is an example. Blade Runner, which came from a great novella called Do Androids Dream of, which is absolutely stunningly brilliant. Total Recall, which is We Can Remember For You Wholesale. It's been made into 2 movies, both of which were bad. But he was one of the most prolific writers, but he was also incredibly psychologically screwed up. He had a twin sister who died in childbirth. He always imagined the 2 of them were connected psychically. He was on drugs. He was convinced the U.S. government had implanted things in his skull. And he wrote a lot of amazing short stories and novellas about that kind of stuff, because I think he thought it was there. Joe Haldeman, who wrote actually one of the classic science fiction books, The Forever War, which I'll talk about a little bit later. That's also in the process of trying to figure out how they're going to film it. That uses special relativity. We started seeing real science fiction with science in it. Larry Niven, who wrote some absolutely stunning pieces. And I'll talk about him because he's one of my favorite writers. C.J. Cherryh, great stuff. And Jack Williamson, who wrote these kind of big space opera stories as well. Dark era, so there's a lot of dark stories, a lot of alternative histories, a lot of time travel where things go south on people. Haldeman writes about an ongoing war that never seems to end, and then using special relativity really doesn't end. Harlan Ellison wrote some very strange stories, and you may have seen, if you watched the original Star Trek, I had it tip of my tongue.
City on the Edge.
City on the Edge of Forever was written by Harlan Ellison, which is an Emmy Award-winning Star Trek episode, one of the few. Really kind of a dark view of things in alternative histories. Modern science fiction kind of died for a while, and it kind of rebuilt itself. A lot of it started with William Gibson in the early 1990s. He started writing these cyberpunk stories. Johnny Mnemonic, which is a Hugo Award-winning short story, which was made into an incredibly rotten movie with Keanu Reeves, but it had some really neat things in it. Greg Benford, who's actually a scientist, was a physicist at Caltech for a number of years. Neil Stevenson. Harry Turtledove writes the best alternative history stuff I think I've ever read. Absolutely stunning. It's this sideways travel through time. You don't travel in your own time frame. You can travel sideways into alternate universes and come back. Incredibly cleverly written. Michael Crichton, who just died a couple years ago, he wrote some really interesting science fiction. Jurassic Park, of course, he's famous for. He really knew how to stretch facts out to tell you a good story, and I appreciate the fact that he could do that. Hugh Howey wrote this neat book as a fan fiction book, actually. Started online, wrote this kind of little fan fiction blog book called Wool, and then had people suggest modifications, and he ended up publishing a book and getting a huge advance for a 3-book deal. Andy Weir, The Martian, which is up for a National Book Award. It was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in fiction this year. It's about a guy who gets left behind on Mars. And so he uses a Mars rover to get to another launch site. And the science in here is incredibly good because Andy Weir worked at JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratories, and actually knew some of the configurations. And I've read this book. It is phenomenal. Probably the best new science fiction book I've read in years. Suzanne Collins, as many of you know, wrote The Hunger Games. The first book, brilliantly written. Second 2 books, after she wrote the first book, she got a 3-book deal. Got to get this off the press. This first book took her 7 years to write. The second and third books took a year, so she kind of crammed them in. They're not nearly as good, but they turned into amazing movies. And I'm not a big fan of these kind of stretched out movie series, but this is a good one. And then Orson Scott Card, as many of you know, wrote The Ender's Game, A Speaker for the Dead, and a handful of others. It's another big series. I've only read a couple of his because he gets really weird as you get further into his books. Weird as in none of it makes sense, and he makes mistakes with earlier books to later books, so I quit reading him because, well, he's weird anyway. All right, graphic novels. This is the new kind of hot area. There's a lot of this coming out. A lot of them have been all geared towards superheroes, but over the last probably 5 or 6 years, you're beginning to see more and more of this. It came out of Great Britain. Most of the graphic novels, the really good ones, came out of Great Britain. Alan Moore in particular, George Metzger was one of the first ones to do this. Neil Gaiman has written Sandman series, which is really amazing. Warren Ellis and Brandon Graham have written some really nice stuff. Alan Moore's he's contributed to a bunch of these. Everything from The Watchmen, which was made into a really decent movie, not a great movie, but a really decent movie. V for Vendetta, very post-apocalyptic era in England. A lot of this is related to England, although The Watchmen takes place Antarctica, New York City, and Washington, D.C. This is a comic book, but it's turned into a novel. It actually is a book, and you could see kind of a visualization of how it works. I'm not a huge fan, never been a really big fan of comic books anyway, but I have a handful of these, including Watchmen, and I really haven't been impressed with how that's evolving. My guess is another 5 or 6 years, and it'll become the mainstream approach to reading science fiction, at least one of them. And then, of course, television. Oh, yes. Classic. Stay at home, nothing else to do. First major TV program that really kind of broke the ice in this is Twilight Zone, which I know almost everybody's seen. I know that because usually on Labor Day weekend they have a 3-day marathon of the Twilight Zone on Sci-Fi. You can't help but watch it because once you get pulled into one of those, they're a half hour long. Rod Serling narrated it, smoking on a cigarette. Yeah, here we go. Lung cancer. But the Twilight Zone really kind of gave you a vision that there's other things out there, other stories. And I think this also kind of got that spark going in the 1960s. Outer Limits was kind of an offshoot. It was kind of a, competition with the Twilight Zone, but it was a little different, a little darker in some respects. Star Trek and its 5 spin-offs. Okay, you have Star Trek The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise. I mean, wow. And of course, a whole slew of movies, and now a rebirth of those movies. Star Trek is in itself its own enterprise. And these guys are classics, of which, of course, unfortunately, Jimmy Doohan is dead. Bones McCoy is gone. I have no idea who this dude is. Somebody photoshopped himself in there. I think it's hilarious. Yeah, half this group's gone, so it's kind of sad. X-Files, which actually was it was interesting, it was groundbreaking, because it was this kind of paranormal thing, but it incorporated a lot of UFOs. Just tore up their airways. This really helped build the Fox franchise in the 1990s. And then when Dave Duchovny left with, Gillian Anderson with one more year in her contract. It went south, and it jumped the shark badly when he left. So, which is kind of sad. But now they're in the process of redoing it. Chris Carter has actually been in talks with Fox to rebuild X-Files with kind of a second generation. So we'll see how that works. Dune and Children of Dune. Dune was made into a movie. Francis Ford Coppola, which is a horrifically bad movie. Kyle MacLachlan in that movie has the biggest jaw I've ever seen in my entire life. I always thought Ben Affleck had a monster jaw. You see this movie, and MacLachlan's jaw sticks out like 4 feet. Weird people. It kind of followed the book, but it kind of jumped around. And Kyle speaks perfect American English, and his father speaks like with a very distinct German accent. So it's weird. But the TV movie, which Sci-Fi made in its early days, was actually really well done, and the effects were pretty decent as well. And then they did Children of Dune as a second miniseries that matched it, and they followed the book as religiously as possible. In fact, Frank Herbert was an advisor on the first one; he wasn't on the second, and just did a phenomenal job. And actually, it's one of the few TV series that I've purchased and watched over and over again because it really is pretty well done. Battlestar Galactica. So many of us remember the good old-fashioned Battlestar Galactica from the 1980s, which was pretty cheesy. But then about 10 years ago, pretty close to 10 years ago, they remade Battlestar Galactica. I will tell you that when Kay Sackhoff was brought in to play Apollo. Starbuck.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, this is gonna suck. And then I watched the first season. And I went, holy crap, So actually, for a while, Richard and I would watch that clock, and we were going to be out of here in time to get home to watch Battlestar Galactica. So 5 seasons. It was an amazing. Ron Moore's work was amazingly well done, and probably one of the better TV series, 5-year series that ever came out. Fringe, of course, was kind of an offshoot, a really weird mix of time travel and X-Files. It had this kind of love-hate relationship. Fox wanted to cancel it 3 times in a row, and fans just flooded the airwaves and emails with, keep it on, and they finally got 5 full years in, and actually had good closure, wrapped it up pretty nicely. The Time Tunnel was the first science fiction TV series I watched when I was a kid. Seriously, I watched Star Trek off and on, but Time Tunnel, where these 2 guys went back in time, it was remade in the 1990s as Quantum Leap with a little different modification to it. Both of these are time travel stories, and they're absolutely clever. They do the same thing, by the way. I actually think most of Quantum Leap was nothing more than Time Tunnel just rewritten with a single guy as opposed to 2 people. And both of them had to do with changing behavior in the past, which was kind of neat. And the Stargate SG-1, which came from a movie, Stargate, actually was a decent TV series as well. And this is a connection by wormholes. You got these little rings. You step through the ring, it takes you to another civilization. It has another wormhole. You pop out, and you get to travel faster than the speed of light through hyperdimensional space, which, okay, I can live with it. That made sense. And then, of course, movies. First big, serious production value science fiction movie was Forbidden Planet. Leslie Nielsen, in one of his first starring roles, serious roles, eventually became funny. The Day the Earth Stood Still, both these about the same time, but Forbidden Planet is really has a very intense psychological aspect to it. Day the Earth Stood Still, probably one of the greatest science fiction movies ever made, 2001: Space Odyssey. I'll talk about that a bit too. Star Wars, which actually, as much as there's a lot of things wrong with this, lightsabers, faster than the speed of light, and there's a lot of things scientifically wrong with lots of explosions in space. This rebuilt science fiction movies in the 1970s. Science fiction was dead after 2001: Space Odyssey. They made some terrible movies, and then Star Wars came out, and it changed everybody's perspective a lot. Now, granted, in the 1990s when Lucas did the prequels, everyone hated it because, he destroyed the franchise. But it may be reborn. We'll find out. Alien, which was, again, one of those, a real horror movie in space, but it used some really cool technology along the way. Okay, there's sound in space. I admit that was one issue. Blade Runner, this is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? This is Harrison Ford was kind of he had done Indiana Jones, he'd done Star Wars, but this kind of gave him a whole different perspective, and it was a really cool movie. One of my favorites as well. Minority Report, another Philip K. Dick short story, which was turned into, surprisingly enough, a decent movie with Tom Cruise, precogs, trying to predict crime before it actually happens. Cleverly done. This is really weird. Another thing that's related to this. Tom Cruise, I've never been a huge fan of Tom Cruise as an actor because he's just kind of weird. Not like off the table weird like Mel Gibson, but just weird. But he has made some really astonishingly good science fiction movies over the last few years. Oblivion, it's very cliche-ridden. It's got a lot of homage to previous movies, but he really played that movie well. He's in another one that I'll talk about a little bit later that just came out this last year, and he's in the process of getting ready to film another science fiction movie. He's really changed the genre a lot. Interstellar, which I'll talk about extensively. This is the big science fiction movie of 2014. And then Ender's Game, which is Orson Scott Card's story. A lot of controversy because some of the remarks he made regarding social issues in the United States, but the movie actually is pretty decent as well. So these are my top 10 choices of movies you should watch, short stories you should read, books you should read, and TV shows that you should go back and look at. I know some of these you might be familiar with, but probably most of you haven't read these because, I'm older than a lot of you, so I read these when I was younger and growing up. Number one book, short story in my opinion, is Nightfall by Isaac Asimov. And I'll just give you a brief synopsis of a couple of these. Nightfall takes place on a planet which is close to the galactic core, in which it has 3 suns constantly in motion. But every couple hundred years, those 3 suns are eclipsed by a dark object. They kind of predict it. And when that happens, they see stars, which they don't think they see. They don't see it. It's always in daylight. The planet's always in daylight. And people go insane. And it's the most brilliantly written short story I've ever read in my entire life. I don't know if it's online, but certainly if you can get your hands on that short story, this will give you a completely different perspective of how the universe would work. I remember reading it, and I remember reading the short story, putting it down, and then picking it up, 10 seconds later, and starting all over again, because it just blew me away. And absolutely the best short story I've ever read. Neutron Star by Larry Niven. Niven's written some really amazing things. By the way, all of these won Hugo Awards or a Nebula Award for Best Science Fiction Short Story and for writing in this given year. Nightfall was written in the 1960s, Neutron Star in 1967. This is basically a flight around a neutron star, and it's very cleverly written. It's got some really cool physics in it. A little wrong, but he wrote about a flight around a neutron star a year before they were actually discovered by Jocelyn Bell. The Green Hills of Earth by Robert Heinlein, a beautiful story about yearning for Earth. And in fact, it was quoted by the Apollo 17 astronauts on their return that they were looking forward to coming back to the Green Hills of Earth, and that just kind of linked up the science fiction these people grew up with as well. The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. Some of you may have read this. This was published in 1948. And they've had versions of this. They actually made a short movie of it. The Purge is an example. That was a movie made this last year. But The Lottery was again, one of those psychological things. How do you deal with a society that's just wrong? Johnny Mnemonic, which is William Gibson's first real piece of work where it's basically you upload information to the brain, just a flash drive in the skull. It was turned into a horrifically bad movie with, again, Keanu Reeves. He's made one good science fiction movie, and everything else, man, it blows. But Johnny Mnemonic was a brilliantly written short story. It's very clever, makes lots of really cool predictions. Dolphins that we can communicate with, kind of by uploading cyber materials into them. There Will Come Soft Rains by Ray Bradbury. One of the first books. It's a short story. It's very short. It's like 3-4 pages long. It's an incredibly short story. It's after atomic war wiped off humanity, and the houses still are automated and they still run. They still try to work, and it's an incredibly clever story. Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes was turned into an incredibly interesting movie with Cliff Robertson many years ago. This won a Hugo Award for short story, and then he turned it into a book later as well. What's that?
The movie was Charlie.
Yeah, the movie's called Charlie. It's about a young man who is mentally challenged, who they figure out this very clever biochemical solution that makes him incredibly smart. And they have a mouse named Algernon that this thing can run mazes an amazing amount of time, and then things go bad. And it is heartbreaking and certainly worth the read. It's Such a Beautiful Day by Isaac Asimov. This is one of my personally favorite short stories. I like Asimov. He's not my number one short story writer, but it's up there. And Such a Beautiful Day is incredibly clever. It's a world in which transportation is done through doors, and doors with a capital D. When you open a door, it transports you to another house, so you can transport. And this little kid can't go through the door; it breaks, so he has to go outside. And he discovers the outside, and so his mom thinks there's something wrong with him, so she makes him see a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist says, "Well, let's go outside. Let's go for a walk." And he'd never been outside in his entire life. And this kid's showing him all this stuff. And at the end of the story, he's about to go through the door. He stands there and thinks about it for a second. He says, "It's such a beautiful day. I think I'll go outside." Amazing. I hate to destroy it, but spoiler alert, it's all tonight. Construction Shack by Clifford Simic, another one. Really clever book. And Last Contact by Stephen Baxter is also an incredibly good short story. These are really two very cleverly written. I'm not going to tell you the spoilers in this one. I like Last Contact quite a bit. It also won a Hugo Award in the 1990s, early 2000s. And they're both really clever. They're in all these are in collections, so you can scrounge around, and a couple of them are online. One I wanted to put on here, but I couldn't quite fit it, because I'm going to go with 10, is Microcosmic God by Theodore Sturgeon. That's got some biology in it, but it's also got some neat physics, and that was also one of my top 3 or 4 of all time. But you know, it's got some stuff in there that's a little different, and so I left it off. Novels. Okay, so you've gotten through the short stories, you kind of whipped through these collections, and now you're starting to look at, well, let's go to the big stuff. Foundation series, of course. Isaac Asimov, the best sequence of all. I'm a big fan of Larry Niven for obvious reasons. The Mote in God's Eye. Well, you know, the first time I read this, I went, "Holy crap! Now that's alien." I mean, these are creatures that are. This is an alien world, and the other thing is this takes place in the coal sack. So anybody who's been in the southern hemisphere and you're looking for the Southern Cross, it's next to the coal sack region. It's a very dark nebula, and there's a period of time where they see this really bright star in the middle of the coal sack, and it turns out it's a laser trying to send a light sail out of this solar system that's kind of buried in the coal sack, and it's definitely worth a read. He wrote a follow-up to it with Jerry Pournelle, and I don't think this is as good, but this is it's a great book. Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein, Grokking, amazing book. Psychological, very strange. Definitely worth reading. It's considered his classic book. Dune by Frank Herbert. He wrote a whole series of these, but Dune, the first one, is definitely an amazing read. Rendezvous with Rama. Arthur C. Clarke has written a lot of amazing books. Childhood End is one of my favorites. If you know a little bit of astrophysics, you know that there are 3 flavors of neutrinos. And it turns out in the late 1990s, we discovered they oscillate between the 3 states, 3 different phases. So there's electron neutrinos, there's muon neutrinos, and tau neutrinos. And they oscillate. We don't really understand why that is. It's a quantum mechanical problem we're still working on. But when we were studying neutrinos, a handful of physicists discovered that the sun was emitting 1/3 the number of neutrinos we expected to find. Now, it turns out the reason is because it oscillates through these 3 phases, and about 1/3 of them in the electron neutrino state reaches the Earth. The other 2 we didn't have detectors that could pick up. In 1999, the SNCC detector up in Sudbury, Canada, picked up the 2nd type, and then it doubled the number we saw, so we understood that it's basically going through three phases. But Arthur C. Clarke, who was an engineer and actually was the first person to theorize that we could build geosynchronous satellites above the surface of the Earth, and actually won a Marconi Award for that idea, wrote this sun-going nova because it was only emitting 1/3 of the neutrinos that it was supposed to. And he was just taking science and stretching the story, which is amazing. Rendezvous with Rama is one of the coolest books because it doesn't have a conclusion. It just ends, and I want to know more right damn now. And now he's dead. So he actually wrote a couple follow-ups, and I won't read them because this book, when I finished reading it, it's like I couldn't put it down, and I just kept going back to it and rereading it. And Morgan Freeman actually has the filming rights for this movie. He keeps trying to make it, but it's the CGI. I think we're there now. I think we're almost there now. But at the time, he couldn't do it. He actually bought the rights in the late 1990s. Fahrenheit 451, which of course is about book burning. Firemen burn books as opposed to putting out fires. Very clever. This has been not only turned into a, pretty bad movie, turned into a graphic novel as well, and there's talk that Universal wants to make this into another movie, want to redo the movie, which would be interesting. I'd like to see that. Ender's Game, which came out as a movie this last year and a half ago. Actually, this was a second book. The first book he wrote was called Speaker for the Dead, and then he wrote a prequel to it, and it's a very cleverly written story about training children as soldiers, and it's definitely worth a read, and actually decent movie as well. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. This is a really, I read this book, I was uncomfortable all the way through it. I put it away after I finished it. About 2 years later, I found it again. I said, I'm going to read it again. It's a kind of a first-person tale, and it's just really, it makes you very uncomfortable. Handmaid's Tale is the United States breaks up into, regions, and the protagonist in here is women are put into these positions of, to procreate the part of the country they live in, and she tries to escape. And it's a very cleverly written book, incredibly uncomfortable to read for most people. The Star's My Destination, Alfred Bester. This is the classic space opera story. If you want to read a big, overwhelming, just one book, overwhelming space opera, this has it all. And it's one of the classic, in fact, I think one of the science fiction magazines in 1998 classified as one of the top 3 science fiction books of all time, right after Foundation and Stranger in a Strange Land. And then this book came out 2 years ago, IQ 84. In Japanese, the pronunciation of Q is almost exactly the same pronunciation for the number 9. So it's actually 1984, and Haruki Murakami, this is an alternate history. There are 2 universes side by side. It's a multiverse story. And the protagonists go back and forth between the 2. And it's a pretty thick book. It's incredibly involved. The reason I bought this book and read it, because I'd never heard of Haruki Murakami. He's a very well-known Japanese novelist, best known for a National Book Award finalist for writing about the sarin attacks in the Tokyo subway back in the 1990s. I actually heard them describing this on NPR driving home from work one day, and I went, that sounds really weird. So I was at Barnes & Noble, kind of paging through, and I went, all right, I'll buy it. If I don't like it, I'll just, give it away, I'll donate it. I was absolutely transfixed. One of the best books I've ever read. I now have 3 of his books, and they've been translated into English. He just came out with a new one, which is really kind of cool. Just finished reading it. This book is about, 500 pages long. I read it in 3 days. Nothing else happened. Sorry. It was like, my wife said, "Do you want dinner?" I'm busy. Reading a book? Yes, I am. Okay. TV shows. Okay, I admit, Richard would probably agree with me on a lot of this. Battlestar Galactica, my favorite 5-year series. Just phenomenal. Ending was actually really good in my mind. Fringe, I still think is pretty high up there. Star Trek Next Generation, both of them, they're different, but they're also very special. I'm still torn. Shatner, Picard, I'm sure. Doctor Who is the longest running TV show, science fiction TV show of all time. I will admit I only watched periodic episodes. I don't have the time to really devote to a lot of it. But it's actually a really well done series. They've gone through, 8 doctors now, I think? 9? A lot. But they have one thing in common. They wear really long scarves and they're British. Firefly, which was a short-lived, in fact, all the series, all 12 episodes were not shown on Fox. They canceled it after 12 were shot, but only 9 were shown. So a number of years ago, my wife, as a birthday gift, bought me the set. And I'd seen the first few episodes, and so now I had a chance to watch them straight through. And boy, now I saw it, it's like, damn. I don't know why this didn't stay on. It was amazing. Certainly worth it. X-Files, of course, I've talked about already. Twilight Zone, Red Dwarf, that's a British TV series which has been on a long time as well. It's called Red Dwarf, that's the name of the spaceship. Space 1999, I grew up with this. It was actually made in the 1970s. It was fun to watch. Martin Landau, Barbara Bain were in it. They had the funniest episode where they fell in one part of the ship. The moon gets knocked out of orbit, so it's flying off into space. In 1999. Sorry. Still up there, unfortunately. But there's one scene where they're in a spaceship and a couple of members of their crew who are leaving the TV show to make movies, which they didn't obviously become stars. They get sucked into a black hole, and it's hilarious. I admit it. I personally think it's hilarious. And Babylon 5, which some people absolutely hated and some people absolutely loved, and I kind of found it right in the middle. Had some really neat things in it. I liked watching some of the characters. My favorite part is one of the key members was named Sinclair. So, that's not Sinclair. Sorry. Movies. Okay, now, I tried to put these in the order that I like them best. And I changed these two back and forth 8 times in the past week. Because I cannot decide. I'm sorry. It's a tough call on this one. So I'm going to skip and come back to them. Alien and Aliens. This is, I'm not a big fan of sequels in movies. They drive me crazy, thanks to George Lucas, who I hate. Alien was great. I mean, stunning horror movie. The story, Sigourney Weaver just, kicking ass. I mean, and Aliens, she goes back. And when I saw this in the theater, my wife said, we got to go see this because one of our first dates was to see it. I'm gonna start you off right, honey. There is no sound in space. But then we went to Aliens, and she said, "Well, we saw Alien. We should go see this." Okay, let's go see it. And other than Bill Paxton, it's over, man, it's over. It's actually a really amazing story. Alien 3 and all the rest are crap, but. These two were actually incredibly good. Terminator, which was not a big seller, but Terminator 2 was even bigger. Terminator 3 went south. Now they're going to Terminator Genesis or some crap. They weren't really south. Well, Arnold's back. So anyway, this was Arnold Schwarzenegger's first big major role. He was in Hercules in New York, which they actually dubbed someone else's voice in because they couldn't get through the accent. But he had 17 lines in this movie. That's all. And he was brilliant. I mean, if you watch this for the first time, if you've never seen it, or if you see it again and you haven't seen it in a few years, just look at him. I mean, he's a robot. I mean, he's better than Keanu Reeves when it comes to no expression. And yeah, when he made Terminator 2, he was different, and he was the same. I don't know how he did it. I mean, maybe because he actually made movies in between. But this was actually one of the best 2-piece combinations ever. Minority Report. I actually like this movie. It's surprisingly enough, yeah, it's Tom Cruise. There's some really kind of weird stuff in it. Colin Farrell's in it, which actually he did a decent job in it. It's a good story. It's a Philip K. Dick kind of a mind bender, and I liked it. It was actually very cleverly done. The whole idea that you could maybe predict the future and then arrest people before they commit crimes. Very strange idea, but I really do like it. Gravity, which came out a little over a year ago. This was nominated for Best Picture. There's very few science fiction movies get nominated for Best Picture. It was actually considered to be in the top 3 for Best Picture last year. Sandra Bullock was obviously the protagonist. I liked the movie a lot because the physics was really pretty amazing in it. I didn't like the movie for one simple reason, and I don't have a problem without taking out the the astronaut diaper and all the gear. I mean, you can't. It takes 4 hours to put on an astronaut suit. You can't sit there for 4 hours watching her kind of struggle to get out of this thing. That would be a terrible movie. The only thing I didn't like about it is she goes from the Hubble Space Telescope, the International Space Station, to Chongqing, the Chinese space station, which they haven't actually launched yet. And it's all the same plane, and she uses a fire extinguisher to get to the Chinese. That was a little bit over the top, but I did appreciate it. Forbidden Planet, a classic one I enjoyed. Blade Runner, another Philip K. Dick story. Which I really did enjoy. It plays a little bit in the future. It's got some kind of neat ideas, and it really was a very well done movie. Children of Men, which was not seen by very many people. It didn't really hit the theaters. Brilliant. It's in a future not that far removed where Children aren't born. I mean, there are no children being born, and this one woman gets pregnant, and they do everything in their power to keep her alive. And it was incredibly intense and brilliantly done by the same director who did Gravity. And then Source Code, which is a kind of a time travel quantum story, which I'm not a huge Jake Gyllenhaal fan. He's done some neat things. But this movie had a really cool kind of back and forth. And by the end of this movie, as I told my wife, they could have ended it at one spot and it would have been a great movie. They could have ended it at another spot and it was still a great movie. And they ended it a third time, I'm like, wow, blown away. All right, let's talk about these two. I actually made a comment on Facebook that I was going to give this talk tonight. And one of my former students said, well, let's see, if it's an hour long, 50 minutes will be about Interstellar. You know? It won't be that long, I'm not going to go that much longer. Okay, so 2001 Space Odyssey to me has always been the classic movie. I saw it when I was 13 years old. This was in 1968, it was filmed in 1967, Stanley Kubrick. Nominated for Best Picture, by the way, but didn't win. Instead, it was Oliver. Mo, please. Mo. I'm going to slap that kid so hard. I'll give you more. A soup spoon to the forehead. This movie was, the technical advisor was Arthur C. Clarke. He took the story from two different, he wrote the book. It was a novelization of the movie. He took it from two short stories that he'd written in the 1940s and 50s and turned it into this movie. And Kubrick wanted it to be the absolute true to science fiction and to science. There is no sound in space. They put a lot of music, you know, it kind of reintroduced a lot of people to classical music, but it is brilliant. The free fall motion's not bad. The relative motion is stunningly brilliant. The story is amazing, and that last 30 minutes nobody gets, which is why it was brilliant. It's non-linear. It's a brilliant movie, and if you've never seen this movie, you got to watch it on Blu-ray because you need to see. The images of the moon are just stunning, and astronauts actually made comments. The Apollo 8 astronauts that December who did a flyby said Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick got it right, and this is a brilliant movie. There's no question about it. Interstellar. Chris Nolan did the same thing. He said, I want to make the most accurate science fiction movie I possibly can. The advisor for this movie was Kip Thorne, who is a retired professor of astrophysics at Caltech. I found it really fascinating that Phil Plait, who writes the Bad Astronomy column, just went after this movie. He said, oh, you can't do all this stuff. And then someone said, you realize, of course, that Kip Thorne actually did all the calculations, and they're in the process of writing 2 papers based on the images that came out of Interstellar. Phil, you're wrong. So he apologized. He admitted he kind of screwed up on that one. But I don't like the movie. So, you know, once you kind of go back a certain distance, you can't go any further. Okay, so as far as the movie's concerned, how many of you have seen it? Okay, a few. It comes out on March 31st in Blu-ray. I was hoping March 10th, but I have to wait a couple more weeks. It's a story about us trying to get off this planet. And the physics is absolutely incredible. Lorentzian wormhole to fly through to another part of the galaxy. Gargantua is this massive black hole. The light curve structures, the way it bends light in a rotating black hole, this is the way I've seen it in my head for years as I first started studying black holes. The story's a little thin. There's some issues with it. Maybe I'll just do a talk on it someday, maybe next February or March. Number 14. But the physics is absolutely phenomenal. The special relativistic effects of Matthew McConaughey traveling through these special relativity structures, visiting a planet where the relative speed of a person in orbit around the black hole and the people on the planet, it's a 7-year to 1 hour ratio. 1 hour on a planet is equal to 7 years in space. He worked out all of the mathematics. In fact, he actually published a book on the science of Interstellar, and this is absolutely one of the top 2 movies I've ever seen in terms of science. In terms of the story, probably 2001: Space Odyssey is better. The nonlinear behavior at the end especially, which I actually enjoyed, but I think the physics of Interstellar is just as good, and it's an absolutely phenomenal movie. And like I said, when it comes out on March 31st, my guess is I'll be getting 2 copies, one for my son and one for my wife, and I'll have one at school, one at home. But anyway, yeah, this is really a pretty phenomenal movie, and I certainly recommend it. Okay, so the worst 10 choices, in my humble opinion. I just gotta put them up. I almost didn't put this slide in, but I decided to add it. Plan 9 from Outer Space. Ed Wood, oh my God. You can see the strings on flying saucers. The beginning of the movie has Bela Lugosi in the only 8 minutes of film, and then he died. So Ed Wood had his girlfriend's chiropractor play Bela Lugosi with a toupee on, and he walks around with a sleeve covering his face, and you can tell it ain't him. Holy crap. There's so many things wrong with this movie, you can't even begin to start to describe all of them, but it's a cult classic, and it is. Actually, Ed Wood in the 1970s was voted the worst director of all time, and when you see this movie, you will know why. You will not need to see any of his other movies, because you don't want to, but that one's bad. The Happening. Okay, so some of you may have seen this. M. Night Shyamalan made this. Okay, he made Sixth Sense, which was brilliant. It was his first movie, and he absolutely fell off a cliff from that point on. He's made, 8 movies. Every one of them's lost horrific amounts of money. But somehow, because of that first movie, they think he's going to bring movie magic back, and he's now making another movie this year, which will come out this... I'm not going to watch that. I can't stand it. This is The Trees Decided to Declare War on Humanity. Suffice to say, it is mind-bendingly stupid. Close-ups of Zooey Deschanel. I love her. Her eyes are just absolutely gorgeous. The close-ups were so close, it scared the crap out of me. And Mark Wahlberg is a biology teacher? Never going to happen. Revolution. This was a TV series that just didn't make any sense. I watched like the first 3 episodes and I couldn't figure it out. I mean, it's like, I don't know, the world loses power, and then, I don't know, we're supposed to survive somehow, but yet someone's got the secret to power. So I quit watching after 3 episodes, and NBC canceled it 2 episodes later. Lost in Space, both the TV and the movie. Danger, Will Robinson. Okay, the TV series was, my parents thought I loved science fiction. I watched the first episode, and I remember this distinctly because I was sitting in the living room. We had one of those big old-fashioned console TV sets, had the little stereo in it, the whole thing. And my parents going, this is going to be a science fiction TV show, you're going to like this. And as soon as it was over, I turned to my mom and I said, don't ever tell me when this is on again. I went to my room and started reading. They made a movie of it with William Hurt, who actually was brilliant in Dune and Children of Dune, in Dune, but it was, I don't even know how to describe how bad it is. Interstellar Empire, all right, John Brunner, this is amazing. When Brunner published this book, he admitted it was the most cliche-ridden book he could possibly write. Because he wanted to see, he had a 5-book deal with Ballantine in the 1970s, 60s and 70s. And he wanted to see if he could, this is what he said in an interview in the 1980s, he wanted to see if he could publish trash. And because he wanted out of the contract and they wouldn't let him out, so he published this thing. And it is horrific. I mean, it is absolutely horrific. The worst short story of all time is Master of Life and Death by Robert Silverberg. By the way, these 2 guys are actually really good writers. I mean, Silverberg won a Hugo Award for one novel of his and 1 short story. But Master of Life and Death is considered the worst science fiction short story of all time on like 12 different lists. I know, I looked them all up. Time Cop, that actually lasted on ABC for a year. I mean, they actually filmed like 13 episodes. And then they ran it reruns twice. It's a cop who goes back in time and screws things up really badly. The Missionaries by D.G. Compton. D.G. Compton actually wrote some episodes for Star Trek, but the missionaries are biker aliens who travel to other planets to help them become one with nature. Yeah. I think D.G. Compton used a lot of LSD. I would have put this near the top, but no one seems to remember this TV show. It's called Earth 2, and I watched both episodes that were on television. There's actually 9 episodes that were filmed by CBS, okay? And this was filmed and shown like in 1999. I told my wife about this story 3 or 4 times. She goes, no, I don't remember it. We watched it together. Nope, I don't remember it. I think she just kind of, those traumatic events in life you forget. I think that's what happened here. This is, okay, so Jean-Jules Lagrange in the 1700s showed us that there are these stable positions between 2 planetary systems. So the Earth-Moon has 5 Lagrange points. There's Lagrange point, it's a balance point basically, where things are balanced gravitationally between 2 objects. So between the Earth and the Moon, the Lagrange point is close to the Moon because it's very small and it's far away from the Earth. There's a Lagrange point outside of it. There's a Lagrange point on the far side of the Earth that's actually the same position as the Moon, except exactly 180 degrees from the Moon. And there's 2 Lagrange points 60 degrees behind the Moon. So satellite debris shows up there. We actually have 3 small asteroids that are in one of the Lagrange points, Lagrange 4. And when the Webb telescope goes up, one of the first missions it has is to look in the Lagrange 5 position to see if there's anything there as well. Jupiter and Saturn both have Lagrange clumps of asteroids in the 4 and 5 position. These are very stable positions. But Earth 2 was written by 2 people who proudly proclaimed, when this was being shown by CBS, that they knew nothing about science fiction, had never read any science fiction, had no background in science. One of them had read an article about Lagrange points. And so Earth 2 consists of the Sun, the Earth on this side of the solar system in our orbit, and Earth 2 on the other side. So the story is, we launch a spacecraft that goes around the Sun, just staying in orbit, letting that come to us has been a lot easier. But anyway, it goes to the side, lands on Earth 2, where they discover human beings and dinosaurs living together. Creationist dream. And it was literally, the first episode, I literally threw up in my mouth at least 3 times. It was brutal. And I started laughing the second episode, and I told my wife about having the second episode, I said, how did this ever get on TV? And the next week it was gone. So I guess I called that one. I've looked on YouTube, I can't find it. I know it's got to be out there. Someone's got to have these 9 episodes someplace. Maybe CBS destroyed all the tapes. I don't know. And then The Eye of Argon was a novella written by Jim Thice in the 1970s. It's actually been turned into a game. For a while. Gamers were playing this kind of as a role-playing game. But he wrote this novella that's like 45 pages long, and it's considered the worst novella of all time as well, just because it absolutely makes no sense. Okay, it's basically like Battlefield Earth. Have you ever heard of this movie? This is the John Travolta Scientology movie, where aliens invade Earth, and then the Neanderthals on Earth take over spaceships and destroy never mind, it doesn't make any sense. It's kind of the same thing. There's a barbaric tribe that's taken over by beings with a higher power, and the barbaric tribe figures out all the technology to destroy the beings with higher power. And it is, I actually have read this, and it's really hard to remain, non-judgmental, but holy crap, does this thing suck. It is horrific. I've never read dialogue like this. I've heard it. In the third Star Wars, the third prequel, the scene where Natalie Portman and Hayden Christensen are talking to each other, and she says, "I love you," and he says, "I love you more." Okay, that is the worst 2-line dialogue I've ever heard in my entire life. This is full of that kind of stuff. I need you. I need you too. I need you more. Please, no, don't kill me. All right. Future of good science fiction. There's a future for this. And the main reason is because we have another generation of young writers. Andy Weir just kind of opened the door to this. Suzanne Collins did it. There's a handful of writers who are kind of getting into this. A lot of them came out of the young adult group and started to move up. But Andy Weir really... let's put it this way. Any science fiction book that gets nominated for a National Book Award is a freak of nature. And Andy Weir is, he's going to have a big book deal after he's going to be a finalist, because they announce finalists next week. And then probably the winners, I think, in the middle of March. So they're coming. I mean, there's a lot of young people who are kind of getting into this because they've seen a lot of science fiction. A lot of it bad, but some better. Another generation of really young filmmakers. We've got a lot of young filmmakers who are making some really good science fiction. Now, granted, Chris Nolan's a little older than a lot of the younger ones, but there's a lot of really young guys out there and young women now who are getting into this field as a filmmaker, which is kind of cool. But what I really think the big difference is better CGI. Okay, you add CGI and you can do some cool things. One of the neatest movies I've ever seen this last year, and actually Spencer Henning recommended, was a movie called Snowpiercer, which is on a train. It's global, cooling. I mean, we tried to stop global warming, we screwed it up, and so the Earth's really cold, and they're on a train that kind of makes a year-long loop. And there's no real story outside of it, but it is phenomenal. Written by a young Japanese, Korean writer, brilliantly directed, very, very intense, and certainly one of the best movies I've seen in the last few years. Great CGI in that movie, stupendous CGI. A lot more technical support and more scientists willing to advise. When Arthur C. Clarke did 2001: Space Odyssey, he was already a science fiction writer. It was kind of expected, that'd be something he would do. When Kip Thorne said, "I'll advise," I'm the scientific technical advisor for Interstellar, and 2 astronauts were technical advisors for Gravity, I think that kind of opened the door, because there's a lot more of these guys now who are saying, you know what, I can talk about this. I can jump in. I can be an advisor. I can make sure the science is really good. And I think the success of Interstellar, because it's made close to $400 million at a cost of about $150 million, I think that opens the door for a lot more people to say, I want to get into this. And there is an ever-increasing audience. I think people like to see a future. I mean, right now we're in a lot of kind of post-apocalyptic type of things like Hunger Games, but I think there's some real neat things that can be seen outside of the realm of where we're at. I mean, we live in a world that's got a lot of things that are screwed up. It's been that way, by the way, for a really long time, 2 millennia. And the fact is that a lot of science fiction is very hopeful. And I think it opens the door to the possibility there could be some really neat things happening in the future. And to be honest with you, I will tell you, I think one of the greatest technological advances came out of Star Trek. Because I've got my own communicator right here. But it's better than Star Trek because I can Google stuff. All right, so movies to watch for. These are ones that you might want to get now. They're kind of out there, and a few that are coming out. I want to name more, but I knew it was going to be right here at that point. Under the Skin came out last year. It is a very surreal, nonlinear movie. It's got Scarlett Johansson in it. She's an alien visiting Earth, and it's bizarre in a lot of ways. I've watched it twice. First time I watched it, I kind of went, that was just really weird. The second time I watched it, I went, wow, that was really pretty neat. The ending scene just blew me away. Project Almanac is a time travel. There's a few of these coming out now. It's a time travel story that's kind of like lost footage. They find Blair Witch Project, Apollo 18, lost footage stories about going back in time and trying to fix time. Oh, please don't. If you do that, don't. Tomorrowland. It's a kind of a weird version of, Westworld, but it's a more modern take and a opportunity to see a different kind of universe, alternative universe as well. George Clooney actually is producing it in this as well. The Moon, the Sun, I'm really interested in. This is a really interesting movie that's coming out this July. I think it's July. It was a Hugo Award-winning book. And the woman who wrote it, it's about the 1800s, where people in the 1800s make first contact with an alien race. And unlike Cowboys and Aliens, which is god-awful bad, this is really the psychological impact on an era of the 1800s where, we are no longer, the kings of the world. I mean, it looks incredibly different. And I'm really interested in seeing this movie. This is the one that's right now at the top of my list. Edge of Tomorrow, another Tom Cruise movie. It's kind of a time travel movie, but not quite. It goes back and forth. It's actually a video game movie. The director actually said it's like a video game. You die, you're reborn, you keep fighting, and you get better each time. And I actually enjoyed this movie. This is really cleverly done. Right now, it's probably going to be my Sci-Fi Film Fest, which is in about a month. It's probably going to be my good movie because Interstellar is not out yet. And then I will admit, I am a Star Wars fan. But J.J. Abrams now is doing Star Wars 7: The Force Awakens, and I'm very interested in seeing this in December. I have high hopes, and the reason I have high hopes is because I kind of think the Star Trek franchise was about to just kind of collapse on itself. It was horrible. And then Abrams came along and rebuilt kind of reimagined Star Trek. The second one wasn't quite as good as the very first reimagined one, but I'll tell you, his selection of people, Zachary Quinto and Chris Pine to play Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, Spock and Kirk, holy cow, genius. I mean, absolute genius. And Star Wars was his first love. So my guess is he's putting a lot of thought. I mean, this is going to take, they're still filming. I mean, partly because Harrison Ford broke his ankle, but you know, they're filming this, and it's going to have a lot of the old timers that are going to have their roles in it, but it builds a whole new, set of movies. And there are high hopes, and he's also a little bit more, scientifically literate at how all this works.
George Lucas is out of it?
What's that?
George Lucas is out of it?
George Lucas has nothing. In fact, and part of the contract when he sold to Disney was that he has no creative control whatsoever. So he actually sent him, apparently a couple months ago, he sent him a list of ideas, at which J.J. Abrams said, we already have our team done. So, thank you, God. So that's it. All right, so I'm done. I'll answer any questions I possibly can about science fiction and good science, and we'll go from there. So.
All right. Silent running and enemy mine.
Okay. What you want me to
Just
my
they were
my
not
reaction to it?
List,
Silent Running. That's a Bruce Stern movie, and he is seeding planets, and he's by himself. I mean, it's a cool psychological story because it's like he needs communication and he needs human contact. It's actually the first time I saw that, the first thing that came in mind, there's a scene where he's actually touching and holding on to his robot, trying to hold it. The first thing that came in mind are these, in the 1960s, there were experiments done with monkeys, but they were separated and given a mechanical device that fed them, and they were screwed up. And this movie was brilliantly done. Very sad.
Because like Moon, it was done on a very low budget.
Yes, yep. And not a lot of CG, not a lot of cool special effects, but really a neat story. Enemy Mine, I'm 50-50 on it. It was Lou Gossett played the alien, and he was pretty alien. He is a male who gives birth, which is kind of weird.
Yes. That's why I like it.
Yeah, Dennis Quaid played the human protagonist. It had kind of a cheesy ending. I mean, there's part of it that's kind of okay. The fact that these two are antagonists who become, co-protagonists, I thought there was parts that were really well done. I think it suffered from we need a happy Hollywood ending, and
I liked it because of the representation of the alien.
It's different.
The other movie I just popped in my mind was District 9.
Now I will tell you, District 9. When I first saw it, I almost predicted what was going to happen as each piece would happen. But Neil Blomkamp did a much different approach to it. The end was not a nice, neat, happy ending. It was, kind of an expectation of another movie, which he's not going to make. He's now said he's not going to make a sequel. It doesn't.
All my favorite movies like that are really low budget.
Turned
out to be extremely.
And in many respects, Snowpiercer's like that. It wasn't a big budget movie. It was a much different, dark movie, incredibly dark movie, which has just a gut-wrenching aspect to it, and it's brilliantly done. And I think District 9 was like that. Lots of really neat pieces built into it. Brilliant acting. Sharlto Copley played a phenomenal role in that, and it's opened up a lot of doors. There's a movie that Blomkamp's also making that's coming out this year called Chappie, which they've been advertising, about a robot that's actually a military robot, and Sharlto Copley plays that character as well, but it's been sort of dismantled, and then one of the robotic engineers decides he's going to kind of disconnect the military part of it, and then suddenly they want to use him, for gangs. It looks like an interesting movie. The trailers I've seen look kind of freaky and weird, and I kind of like that approach, because nonlinear science fiction to me is always more fascinating than the standard story. Protagonist, he needs a mentor dies, protagonist has a battle, climax, happy ending. So, that's how most of them are written. So that's kind of a bug in my shoe. So, yes.
Well, Mark, wanted to be here tonight, but he decided to go to Detroit tonight rather than waiting tomorrow.
Avoid the snow.
Yeah,
Good
smart
idea.
But first to me, a movie that he shows to each of his classes that he teaches at Western Astronomy is Contact.
Yes.
Didn't mention that one.
You know,
Yeah.
I have a love-hate relationship with Contact. Okay, and I'll tell you why. I think it's a 2-hour, almost exactly 2-hour movie. I think an hour and 55 minutes of that movie is one of the best movies I've ever seen in my entire life. Jodie Foster is, you know, she is a scientist. She is a SETI researcher in an era which we still, to a great extent, we're not going to fund it. She's got to scrounge up money. She does everything in her power to do this. We get a communication from Vega, which is a very, very young planetary system, not even a planetary system at this point. And so we know it's like a transmitter. It sends us this primer to build a machine which allows us to travel to meet aliens. It's the first Contact movie, which is why it's called Contact. I think it's incredibly well written. I think the thing that bugs me about this movie, I don't think it needed the Matthew McConaughey love part of it, because that just always, I mean, when you have, that's like a Hollywood thing.
Yeah.
But the part that drives me crazy about this is that all the way through this movie, she is a serious scientist. She's focused on her science. She's focused on making connections. And then, at the end, she's sitting in front of a congressional hearing, James Wood, who's attacking her, and she breaks down and cries. I did experience... Okay, if this was a real Jodie Foster, she'd have climbed over that bench and slapped the shit out of James Wood. That's my personal opinion. Instead, she cries, and then the end, you know, Matthew McConaughey, you know, they ask him, you know, what do you think? He goes, well, frankly, I believe her. Love. And then she smiles at him, and that's the end. Okay, so that just blew the story out of the water. Up to that point, brilliant. I mean, it's great science. I mean, they're talking about the strength of the electromagnetic signal they're getting. It's in Jansky's, which is the proper term. They're talking about how far away it is in terms of light years, proper terms. They filmed it at the Very Large Array in New Mexico, where it's all done. I mean, we showed it up here one time from my Sci-Fi Film Fest. It's a great movie, but that last 5 minutes just kind of it was stupid. It was a Hollywood happy ending. And my wife told me after she saw it in theater, she said, you know, she's not a big science fiction fan, but she said that last 5 minutes turned into a chick flick. And that's what my wife's saying this, not me. And I have to agree because I love my wife and I'm afraid of her. Yes?
They didn't use Sagan's ending in the book.
No, they didn't use Sagan's ending in the book, which is another thing that drove me nuts. Yeah.
That's the most provocative part of it.
Yeah. Seeing pi in the stars. I mean, it's just very cleverly done. So, in code. Yes.
As to bring up your books we were talking about at the beginning.
Oh yeah, thanks. Oh, all right. So one of my, I said nonlinear stories, but one of my favorite writers already mentioned is Larry Niven. Niven wrote Neutron Star. He's written a bunch with Jerry Pournelle, Molten God's Eye, Legacy of a Rogue, which is a fascinating book of colonizing another planet. One of the greatest books he ever wrote, and I wanted to put on the list, and I thought, well, I can't get them all in here, is a book called The Integral Trees. And he wrote a follow-up called The Smoke Ring. He really describes the physics incredibly well. So basically, the story consists, there is a yellow star that's in orbit around a neutron star, because he loves neutron stars, obviously, which has this kind of big, like dust cloud, which we've seen around a lot of objects. And at the distance from about almost one Earth orbit radii out, there is a region where nitrogen oxygen tends to mix. And in Niven's description, it's almost as if there was a planet here, but it kind of got to that Roche limit, and then it started to tear up. But there's trees that grow there, and a human colony crash landed on one of these trees. And the trees are in the shape of a big integral sign, which is why they're called integral trees. And the main character protagonist realize there's something wrong with the trees. They're rotting from the inside. And what they're doing is that the tip of the branches, the tip of the tree, which is a big integral sign, that's where all the growth's at. And what happens, these trees periodically snap apart and they scatter their seeds, which then build new integral trees. And so this guy realized there's something wrong with the trees, and he tries to get a band to join him so they can survive this thing breaking apart. And And it's a stunningly brilliant book. And he wrote a book called The Smoke Ring to follow up, which is, how the colony then survived. But it incorporates a little bit of human evolution because, humans are, we're 6 feet tall and our fingers and toes are a certain length. To adapt in this system, at the ends of the trees, it's about 2/3 Earth gravity. The middle of the tree in the smoke ring is free fall. So as you get closer to the center, you begin to experience free fall. So these people travel back and forth along the tree for communications, to gather food, and they grow stuff in the furrows of the tree and all this stuff. They tap fluid out of the tree. They've adapted, over several generations. They have longer fingers. So they're not human, but they're human. It's an incredibly rich, detailed story, and one of the better books I've ever read as well. But it's, again, I got a ton of these books I'd prefer to spend hours with, but I won't. So, any other questions?
I was just
Yeah.
wondering, do you know if you can get a lot of these movies and stuff on Hulu in the public library?
Hulu's got a bunch of them. There's no doubt you get a bunch of them on Hulu. The library has a vast majority of these books, and actually the short story collections are, Valentine made a whole bunch of short story collections. They had a beautiful series in the 1970s and 80s. And I'm willing to bet you can find almost every one of these at the local library. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let's go ahead and call it, we'll
Right.
stop there. Thank you, Mike.